Okay. So yeah, we're happy to have Erica Mulholland and Tony Holler here with us today. Um, Maybe we could just start. So we're going to be talking about speed-based approach to soccer. We called in the advertisement we called it speed-based football or speed-based soccer. Maybe we could start with you, Erica, and then afterwards, you, Tony, just to say a little bit about yourself and what that means to you, like to talk about speed-based soccer or speed-based sports. What does that even mean? And maybe also just give a little bit of background about yourselves, and then we'll go on to some different topics after that. So go ahead, Erica, if you want.
All right. Yeah, I'm Erica and I am in Florida. I'm a youth female athlete performance coach. I mainly work with soccer girls, but I also work with other field and court-based sports like basketball, field hockey, flag football is really big down here for girls. So any sport that involves the strength, power, and speed side of things and injury resiliency side. And I've been doing it for over 14 years now. Time has definitely flown. I really love working with youth, especially because I feel I can make an impact on them young. And I also see a lot of, like you said, Brent, just more burnout, overuse. A lot of girls are really overtraining, and it's causing a lot of not just the overuse injuries, but we're finding now that fatigue is one of the biggest factors in ACL injuries. So, a couple years ago, I got connected with Tony and started diving more into his work. And he was saying the opposite of what the soccer community was saying, because soccer is always like, well, more endurance, more conditioning. And Tony was saying you need to prioritize speed. So I started incorporating his concepts of speed-based training with my own girls, and they've thrived. They've not only gotten faster, but they've stayed healthy, especially during the long season. And yeah, I really think this works, this approach. There's something really magical about it. And yeah, we've been doing it for the past few years and we're not turning back. And I'm a big proponent that yes, players should condition, but it should be at their practices with their team coach. And coaches need to understand how to condition well within small-sided games. And unfortunately, not every coach does. And they do more off the ball conditioning. But with my soccer background, I'm also starting to help consult coaches on small-sided game design to get the conditioning effect that they want. So players are still training on the ball and doing more of the sport-specific conditioning, and then also letting them know, hey, here's when we train off the ball, and that's mainly the speed, strength, and power qualities that get them faster and keep them healthier.
That's really interesting. So there's a lot of points there to come back to because I feel like over here in France where speed I mean where soccer is really has a high priority kind of culturally, and it attracts a lot of good athletes and everything else. And the French, the FFF is meant to be a model, for a lot of other countries to look at and to try to imitate. And they've won World Cups and everything else. I've always felt like they're still leaving money on the table when I look at how they develop youth. Because I just think they're training the kids 4 times a week, 5 times a week. There's no strength training. And then I think there's some kids who are able to resist it, but I also think they're leaving money on the table because they're breaking down a lot of kids with really really heavy volume, and they're selecting for speed. They place a really high priority on speed, but they're detraining it. They're kind of actively killing speed. So yeah, so I want to come back to a lot of those points. That's really fascinating, and also talk a little bit about how do you, with this feed the cats approach that Tony is probably going to tell us about here in a second, how do you integrate that into a long season with a lot of volume, and it's not necessarily an obvious thing to do when you're training 3 or 4 times a week and you have a match on the weekend and everything else. So yeah, really really fascinating. Okay, so Tony, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe the feed the cats approach and what that is and why it might be relevant to soccer specifically, but also maybe other collective sports.
Yeah, well, I'm probably the grandfather of the three of us. I've coached for 44 years. I feel like I've coached longer than that because my father was a coach for 47 years. I have two sons that are coaches. So I've been immersed in this coaching thing in the States mainly in track and field, but also a strong presence in basketball and American football. And the feed the cats approach, let's define what a cat is. A cat is a twitchy, fast athlete. And it's basically the type of athlete that we really cherish in pretty much all sports. Somebody that is a highly competitive, fast, explosive, sometimes seemingly lazy because cats sleep 20 hours a day and the other 4 hours they're at the top of the food chain. They are professional assassins. So when I say feed the cats, what I'm talking about is feeding the athleticism that we all love. And I think that Brent, you did a good job of mentioning that even though traditional soccer is endurance based and skill based, the when you ask a soccer coach, tell me about your best player, or tell me about the players who you recruit, the players that you want on your team. They will say fast, explosive, athletic. They don't talk about slow, weak, but man, they can run all day. That's never the wish of a coach.
They do
So
occasionally they do occasionally talk about they're exceptional players. So I think that's generally true. And I think I bet Lee would probably confirm that as like the soccer expert who's here on the here on the talk. But there are exceptions, like a player who can read the game really well and who's positionally, astute, and can anticipate the game well in certain positions as like a central defender or maybe a midfielder. They're people who can break the trend, but they're more the exception that proves the rule, I would say.
I'm really glad that you interjected that because so many coaches want to counter the speed explosive argument with the fact that there are athletes who are not as fast and as explosive, but are still great players. And what I would come back to that with was let's take that kid and start when he's about 7 years old and start focusing on speed and explosive athleticism because no matter how good you are, becoming faster and more explosive is never a negative. It will always elevate your game. So if you take that person who is a step slow but is very good in everything else, let's get him one step faster. And I think that the idea that we could get everyone faster, and I love the fact that Erica brought in the injury health issue as well. What we have found is that when people get faster, they get healthier, and vice versa. If somebody runs at a fairly fast speed, is detrained to a slower speed, they become injury prone. And I think that too often, especially in youth sports, we throw 12 eggs against the wall and we pick up the one that doesn't break and say, see, it works. The process works. And we forget the broken eggs. And we can call that survivor bias or history is written by the victors. We cannot just say we have really fast people on our elite teams and then claim that we had something to do with it. Maybe we just chose those people and those people survived the training that we did to them and they remained fast. And so what we want to do is improve the athleticism of all athletes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like Erica, in your experience, could you just like remind us what age kids you're working with? But I just kind of want to have a more general question is within the age ranges that you're working with, in your experience, is speed trainable? I mean, like when I first started working in soccer and applying research in the soccer world in France, we started working with a partner club, Saint Sebastien sur Loire, and I was really struck in talking to the coaches. And I was like, well, how do you select? What's your selection criteria? Who goes in the A team? Who goes in the B team? Who goes in the C team? It's like, oh, we just take the fast ones, basically. We put them in the A team when they're really young. And then they just like they take the good athletes. And I was like, okay, well, what about a kid who's maybe is good, good technically, can see the game. Well, how do you make them faster? It's like, oh, and the answer was we don't. It's just genes. So like in your experience, can speed actually be trained for soccer players, for youth soccer players? Is that a
Oh, absolutely. And there it is the majority genetic, but there is a percentage of speed that is trainable. So why not train that percentage? And the age range of athletes I mainly work with is when kids are very malleable and they respond well to speed training, elastic work, a lot of jumps and hops, being competitive with speed training. So we
is
get
this
the
is it pre-puberty or is it during
pre-puberty,
puberty?
pre-puberty, mainly during puberty, so ages 11 to 13 in girls,
Okay.
and some 14, 15 and up. So
Okay.
a little bit more matured. But yeah, you absolutely can train it, but I always try to communicate with the kids' parents and their coaches that you don't want to compare young soccer players during that time in their speed because you'll have early developers who will always win a physical battle. They have more muscle, they're taller, longer stride lengths. Late developers can't really compete against that. But what I will tell parents is you should compare your kids' speed improvements to them. Keep your eyes on your own paper. You always can improve. But if it's against like other girls in the age group, it's hard during those growth spurt years because some people won the genetic lottery and are
Yeah,
early
sure.
developers. But I think with late developers, it's very fascinating group, and I love talking to parents of late developers because sometimes these parents feel it's a death sentence. I actually think it develops grit and they kind of have to work towards their development a little bit more. Whereas early developers, they're just, they're beating everyone and they don't really have to work for it. But the late developers can really learn that discipline and they kind of develop this chip on their shoulder, this competitive chip. And I also say keep focusing on being technically good. A lot of late developers are very skilled. And I think Tony, you'll agree with me on this. I think a lot of the soccer community thinks you and I are saying, make speed and all this the majority, but we're not. We are not asking for much. 10 to 20-minute sessions of speed. My in-season strength sessions are 40 minutes, 1 to 2 times a week. So this stuff, we don't want it to take away from soccer practice. We don't want to take away from technical and tactical development. We're saying these kids should develop it all. We can develop well-rounded players. And I think it's important that we show kids how to speed train properly, how to strength train properly, especially for the injury resiliency side of things. A lot of the movements they're doing in practice, just the constant running, 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 that breaks down the ACL and the bones and the muscles and the tendons. But when we're doing quality elastic work, quality speed training, strength training, that builds the muscles, tendons, and ligaments. So it's really more the injury piece side for me. Of course, I love the speed side, but I think we should train it all because we want these kids to have long and healthy careers. And I also rehab girls in the second half of their ACL rehab for the return to sport phase. And it's a long journey. It is eternity for these girls. And if I see girls who aren't strength training prior to that injury, then that's a huge problem. Or if they're not speed training prior to the injury. And universally, the girls who have come to me for ACL return never did a proper speed and strength program prior to the injury. And a 12 to 14-month rehab, that's eternity for a teenager. So anything I can do, and Tony keeps preaching this message too, just to help these kids develop physically, not let it take away from soccer development, but work it into the schedule, we've won.
Yeah, anything you want to maybe add to that, Tony?
Yeah, I love the way Erica ended that. We won. I believe this is a win-win situation, that speed training is never going to be the majority of your work. Of course, the majority will always be soccer. But we're talking about maybe a couple, I think if you're really efficient, they can be a couple 20-minute sessions. If you're not efficient and you don't have the technology that you really need. It may take you more like 30 minutes to work with a group of 15 to 20 kids, and that's twice a week. You cannot speed train for 2 hours. You cannot speed train every day. We're talking about 2 days a week. We're talking doing some dynamic warm up. I don't like to call it that. I like to call them speed drills, because speed drills not don't just warm you up. They also reinforce the qualities of high, high velocity training. And so those things I think, followed by a couple time sprints. And you say, well, gee, you're just going to run like super fast a couple times. Yes, you are. And you're going to time that, and you're going to record, rank, and publish that. And you are going to celebrate improvement, and you're going to compete. So it's really important to look at this stuff as not a detractor of traditional soccer, but actually something that will improve the way things have always been done. And I think that it's really smart for the human mind to say, how should we train soccer? Well, let's reverse engineer it. Kids run 6 miles in a match. So let's train them for 6 mile runs. They have to do all the skill work. So of course we're going to reverse engineer that as well. And then you say, well, gee, max velocity sprinting is only about 1% of a soccer match. 1%. So why should we waste any time at all with the 1%? But then you go back and say, oh, but the training of that 1% will bulletproof athletes. And when Erica says how devastating an ACL injury is to a kid, well, if a 15-year-old is out for over a year, we're talking about maybe 7% of their life is spent limping and hurting, and that's over a year of their life where they're not getting faster, they're not getting stronger, and they're not becoming better soccer players. So it is an eternity. And if you've ever had your own child get injured, and had to go through a long rehab situation, it breaks your heart. And I know as a coach, I feel like every one of my kids is my child. And so when I see kids go through that, I'm wanting to bulletproof them. And the best way to do that is to improve their athleticism that on the surface seems like it has nothing to do with soccer, but we want to sprint fast, lift heavy, jump high, jump far. We want to get bouncy, which is also called reactive strength index, RSI, and we want to throw. And throwing is like one of the most, like, no way, we don't even use our hands in soccer. But the ability to rotate with strength through the upper body is important for the athlete himself. So we are going to supplement what seems like an endurance sport with high levels of athleticism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's like, and, I have this experience that I've told you about, Tony, but I don't think I've ever told you about it, Erica, where so I work with this kind of regional level academy in France at Saint Sebastian sur Loire, and one of the things that we did was a randomized controlled experiment where we had some kids. So we basically took the feed the cats approach, and we implemented a warm up. So we replaced out the traditional warm ups twice a week with kind of sprint training where you would do A skips and B skips and box jumps and long jumps and bounded bounds. And we would also do skipping. And then at the end of the warm up, they would just run a competitive sprint twice, or they would run a time sprint twice. And then some kids, they would do that twice a week. Some kids would do that once a week, and some kids did that 0 times a week. And we knew all their starting speeds at the beginning of the year, so we could compare across those different groups over the course of the year the percentage and speed gain. And this was for like 10, 11, and 12-year olds. And then what we found was that you got about a 7% overall speed gain for the twice a week group. For the once a week group, you got a like 4.5, 5% gain, and for the other group, about a 1.5 to 2% overall gain. And what was also really interesting was that for the ones who did it twice a week, with zero exceptions, everyone got faster. For the other groups, there were some who would get faster and some who would get slower over the course of the year. So just based on that, and we did that 2 years. So we did it one year and then we replicated it a second year. So I'm pretty confident that that training program works. But I wonder, and I think this might be more specific to you, Erica, but although Tony, I want to hear your thoughts too. Is like how to like integrate that with heavy volume. So it's like one of the things that I see in France, and most of the clubs they don't do any speed training, but they do a lot, but they just do a lot of trainings. And it's like, and as soon as a kid gets better, they just get hit with more training, and it's just more and more and more and more and more. So it's like the better kids here, and I think it's almost too much. They do 3 times a week training, and I'm talking about like 11 and 12 year olds, and then a match on the weekend. So they're getting, four, and it's always high intensity, high intensity, high intensity, high intensity. And from when I look at it from like a sports science perspective, I think it's too much. And I can't help but wonder. I mean, I'm seeing the speed gains, but I can't help but wonder if they were to adjust the volume, if you wouldn't see more speed gains over the course of the year. And a second point, and then I'll let you take the mic, Erica, is that I kind of also feel like there's a pressure because there's a lot of competition. There's the A team players, the B team players, the C team players, and they're always in competition every week. If you don't perform one week, you're in the team below the next week. And then the training, there's kind of an implicit thing where I think a lot of kids think, well, if I miss a training, I'm gonna lose my spot and I'm gonna go down a team for the next week. And I think that there's a pressure there, a social pressure to overtrain, because if you don't keep up with the bandwagon, then you're off and you're not gonna get your spot. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on all of that about the volume and what's the right amount of volume. How should teams deal with the volume if they wanted to make speed a priority? I wonder just what is generally what you'd have to say.
My scenario is going to be a little bit different. So I work in the private sector, so I'm working with girls from all different teams. So different coaches, different practice schedules. So it's going to be very individual. And I've also come to accept that linear periodization is dying in my field, just with the way youth sports schedules are now. So I've really leaned into more of an undulating model. And I really just keep open communication with the athlete, and I actually track their load. We don't have the budget for GPS with what I do, but I've found minutes played in RPE the most accessible way to do it. So I have a whole app that I use that with, and I get their acute to chronic workload score. And that's been really helpful because it lets me know who is indeed overtraining and whose practices are really intense and high volume.
The RPE idea, that's high intensity training, or what is that?
RPE is rating of perceived exertion.
Okay.
So I have all my girls rate all of their practices and games on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the hardest thing they've ever done that they can't walk, and 1 being, oh, this is so easy, I could run a marathon.
Okay. Huh.
So yeah, I have them rate everything they do, whether it's a practice game, they're doing private skills lessons. I need to know what they're doing so they can actually come in and benefit from my training. I don't just want to always give them something if I have no clue they're coming in sore or they had a 2-game weekend. So, as an example, last week I had a girl come in and I had planned to do speed that Tuesday. We were going to do a speed warm up and then strength train. And that's usually how I structure it. Speed first for 10 minutes as the warm up, then we go into the gym. It's just the most efficient way to do it. But she had 2 games the day before, so I had to push her speed day back a couple of days because she came in, she's like, oh, I'm so sore, my hamstrings are torched. And with the Feed the Cats model, you can't train speed in a state of fatigue because the muscles won't be as twitchy, you won't get the most out of the athlete. So I just told her, hey, I can't train speed today. We'll do the slow and controlled strength training and some recovery. We'll save speed for Thursday, 2 days before the game, as a primer workout, which, Tony, I know you're a big fan of doing speed before a game to really wake the nervous system up. So that's just kind of an example of how I individualize it. But at the very minimum, I want to get in at least one, ideally 2 days of speed a week. 2 days is when, girls don't have games the day before, the weekend before, they're coming in fresh. That's when I like to program too. So we try to stick to that 2 time a week model the best we can, so that we keep the girls improving their speed. But, if we have to go down to one and lower the volume a little bit to keep them healthy because they had a heavy training and game week, we'll do that. So
I
it's
mean, do you ever actively just say like you shouldn't go to soccer tomorrow because you're too fatigued? Like
No,
you should just skip a session?
I never hold my girls back from soccer ever.
Hmm.
I just tell them, hey, you have Friday off, take it fully off. Don't go for a jog. And I just let them know, like, hey, here's your off days. Like, actually take them off. Don't do anything. So that's what I would do if I see that workload score really high.
Hmm.
And also when I see it really high, I adjust what I'm doing.
Yeah, really
But
interesting.
another thing I've also seen, especially with girls here when they're going through their school soccer seasons, school soccer is not as high level. And I actually see that they're detraining. And I'll up the speed work and the intensity for those girls who aren't getting enough of it. I've had girls tell me that their school practices, they're just standing around.
Yeah,
So I
I've seen
want
like a
to,
couple of like when we come back to America because we I go over. I have a colleague, this guy Olivier Bluano, and we've traveled all over and help with different teams. We went to America, worked with the college there. We were just in Bolivia with another team, Morocco, France. But the when I come to America, one of the things I'm really struck by is just like how slow the trainings are and how long they are. Like
yeah,
we're always just like sleepy, sleepy. This is like like it's just like a we call it
yeah.
you have the Corver method. We call it the Corver sleeping method because it's just really long and boring. So yeah, I wonder for those sorts of trainings, especially and it's like really hot in a lot of places in America. So the kids are out in the sun for 3 hours, just kind of standing around. That can't be good for the speed.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a big problem. Like a lot of practices here just aren't structured well enough, and there is a lot of standing around for some of the lower level teams, but it's concerning because here in the States, the school season will be before the travel season, and right after school season ends, when they're having these like low level, like hardly doing anything practices, then these girls have to play a showcase, a 4 game showcase with their travel teams. And the load, the intensity just spikes. So my job during that school season is to up the higher intensity stuff, really build that speed and capacity so that the load doesn't spike so much. So essentially what I'm doing is building their chronic load.
Hmm.
So that showcase isn't the first weekend they've run a 30-yard sprint in 3 months. And that's
Yeah.
when injuries happen. And Tony, I know you said something interesting earlier that 1% of the game is max velocity sprinting, but those are the most important moments when goals are scored, but they can also be when injuries happen. So we have to prepare our athletes for the demands of that. And injury only occurs when the demands exceed the capacity of the tissue. So if we're not training those max velocity movements and that 30-yard counter attack is the first sprint that they've done and they haven't worked on it in training, well, in the men's games, what do we get? Hamstring strains. In the women's game, what do we get? Slamming on the knee hard after a 30-yard sprint and tearing their ACL because they didn't prepare for it.
I love that. The whole idea that the 1%, and, I've always said the 1% is the game changer. That the ability, that's why we love fast athletes, is because not that they use it for 100% of the game, but when they do use it, it's really important. But I've never really heard it articulated until just now that kids don't get hurt in the 99%. They don't get hurt walking and moving around and being tactical. When do they get hurt? They get hurt when the demands are high, those critical moments of the game. And so they are relying on tissues of their body that have not been exposed to the stimulus that they need to be exposed to prevent that injury. Now, we can watch kids get injured and just toss them in the scrap heap and say, okay, next man up. And sometimes as coaches, we do that. College coaches, if a kid gets hurt, he said, well, that kid just, was fragile. So we'll recruit another kid to take his place. But I don't want my kid being thrown on a scrap heap. I don't want my
Yeah.
kid being injured because coaches have not exposed them to the requirement, especially if that exposure is minimal, especially if after a speed workout, and Brent, you'll attest to this, the speed workout takes away nothing from practice, nothing at all. In matter of fact, it's the opposite. American football teams have now started to do the atomic speed workout. And if anybody wants to see that, they can look it up. It's free, it's on YouTube. But they're using the atomic speed workout as a potentiator, which means make the next thing better. Or they call it a primer, which is makes the next thing better. Because kids walk into a speed workout feeling okay. Let's say they're a 5 on the scale of 10. And after the speed workout, because it's so nervous system focused, their nervous system's on fire. It's lit up. They are ready to sprint. Their CNS is ready to compete at a high level, and they feel better physically. I can look back at some of the
And
warm up.
that's led some, like, I mean, what is it, like the Indiana team where they won the national title, and they say that it's,
Thank you.
down to down to adopting this approach. I mean, that's pretty striking.
Yes, even though I don't want to take total credit for the University of Indiana's national championship, which was probably the most miraculous turnaround from a terrible football program for the last 100 years to a championship program. But I will just say this: the things they did, 2 speed trainings a week, they got faster in season, whereas 90% of all football teams, American football teams, get slower in season because it's hard, because it's a grind, and they practice about half as long as every other team in the country. They practice less than 8 hours a week, whereas most teams probably practice 12 to 16 hours a week. So they practice less, which automatically creates higher quality. They sprinted in small doses, which made them healthier, which made them improve their speed during the season, not detrain their speed during the season. And if teams are doing all these things and they say that they want their players fresh physically and mentally. And by the way, they also feel the same way about their coaches. They don't let their coaches stay in the office past 6 o'clock at night because they want their coaches to be physically and mentally fresh and on top of their game. And when that happens, we have better quality. And even the old school coaches who burnt the steak every day in practice will still tell you, even though their practices don't reflect this, that they are all about quality in practice, that you are going to play a game the way you practice the game. So quality practice is important even to the biggest offenders of high volume.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I mean, that Indiana story, there was like one of our last webinar, the last installation of this webinar, we had one of our speakers on. His name is Dan Ashman, who's the owner. He's an American owner of a Bolivian club called the Santa Cruz Toucans. And I actually just had the opportunity to go down there and visit. It was really, really crazy and interesting visit. But hey, they've done something radical where they've just totally eliminated endurance work. There's no endurance work. They
Hey,
don't.
did you know, Brent, did you know that Dan Ashman is the publisher for my upcoming book?
I did not know that.
Isn't that crazy?
That
You
is
said
crazy.
Dan Ashman. I'm like, I know him.
Okay, he's the publisher. Okay, wow. Okay, he's
He was the guy. He was the guy that reached out, and this is a very unique situation. Typically, people who have never written a book do not get an advance for a book,
hmm,
but he reached out, gave me an advance. 6 years later, I am 35% done with my final edit, and it will
okay.
be submitted to him by the end of the month. And so, Feed the Cats, the book will happen, and it's because of a mutual friend that we didn't know was a mutual friend.
Wow, that's really, yeah. He was on here. He was on here about a month ago. And I was just down there 2 weeks ago with his with his team and with his club. And he's really taken a lot of those ideas, I guess, in editing the book. I guess
Yeah,
he
yeah.
I guess he read it and he decided to use it. But he's a limit. There's no endurance in the preseason. They do speed training twice a week. They're very conscious about things like volume. And they also, when they recruit players, they look at one of the first things they look at is the player's speed. And then they also look at the player's cognitive abilities, which I like because he's kind of merged your approach with my approach and looking at player vision and everything else. But they went up like he up in a, in an unexpected in kind of an unexpected turn of events. Last year they were in the third division and they went up to the second division. And we went and watched them play, and the difference is speed. You can speed. It's like the players are technically very good, but the thing that the edge that they get is they're just a step quicker than their opponents, and that got them promoted. So you have the American football story, but I've seen it work now in this and also in this context. So I think it's really really interesting and really powerful approach. I'd like to pause there for a second because I think there's a lot more like detailed questions I want to come back to, but I wanted to see like in particular Lee, what he might think, but also anyone else who's in the audience and who wants to ask a question or make a statement. And I saw a post on LinkedIn recently. It wasn't put up by Lee, but I thought it would be interesting as a talking point, which was an idea that speed training doesn't transfer to the field. And I've heard that idea before, which I think is an interesting thing to address. So some coaches here will say, well, if you're running in a straight line and you're improving your max velocity, well, we don't really do that much in soccer. There's a lot of change of direction and everything else. So it doesn't really transfer. So we shouldn't do it. I'd be curious, like Lee, what your perspective is on that. And I'd be curious, Erica and Tony, then what your responses to that could be.
Yeah, well, first of all, it definitely wasn't one of my
No, it
posts.
wasn't one of your posts. No, but
Yeah,
but maybe you could. But since you like know the soccer world better than the other
yeah.
people in the thing.
I mean, obviously, sat here for the last 40 minutes listening to obviously two practitioners who certainly know a lot more about this area than I do. I can just go off my Premier League academy experience with the strength and conditioning of players within the clubs that I work within. And clubs, certainly in the Premier League academy system, they are obsessed with load to make sure that obviously players aren't being overloaded too much. The players get taken out from training or not asked to train if the load has gone too high. They certainly fit in speed and strength sessions during the week. It's certainly in the clubs I worked at. Speed in the Premier League, being the fastest league in the world, is very very important. So I very much like everything that Tony and Erica were saying. I suppose I've got a point to make and then a question. For me, obviously, as a sort of like cognitive coach, I think one of the things that speed brings for certainly within soccer, certainly can help to reduce cognitive load of a player because fast players can reduce this load because they can do things like escape pressure. They can reposition themselves into space quicker. They can slow situations down, knowing they've got that explosivity to break free again.
Hmm.
And the game can actually literally feel slower for them. So I definitely think there's a link between speed and cognitive loads that's very important. So that's the point that I had. And then the question is, do you two guys take in maturation when you're training speed in an athlete in terms of the growth spurt
Yeah.
within those obviously teenage years and how that affects what you would do or not do with an athlete?
I think that's a really fascinating question. Yeah, I have some answers, but I want to hear Erica and Tony on that. That's a great
Yeah.
question for the developmental cycle. Yeah.
Yeah. When girls are going through the growth spurt, I definitely adjust the program, but I don't adjust the speed as much. If we're in season, I keep the volume pretty low on speed regardless. It's more the exercise selection in the gym. So just with some of the most common growth spurt injuries girls get is mainly Osgood-Schlatter, knee tendonitis, sometimes heel pain as well. But for the knees, I really like to program a lot of isometrics during the growth spurt just so they're not bending that knee joint so much and irritating that tendon. So I tend to see those girls do really well with isometrics and get great gains since the gains are still more neural and not as much like true strength gains until they're a little bit more mature at age 15, 16. I really think athletes during the growth spurt respond well to light to moderate loads in the gym. This is a big debate in United States strength and conditioning. There's coaches on one side of the internet saying, oh, we can heavy back squat during the growth spurt. And then I'm kind of more, no, we don't really need to rush that right now until the kids have developed control of these exercises. Their tendons have matured more. Their bone density is more filled in. We don't need to rush the heavy lifting. We don't really need to gain strength relative to body weight until they're further along in the teenage years. So I really think during the growth spurt, it's all about control of the main movement patterns in the gym, especially through isometrics to protect the knees, and then just giving them a variety. So really balancing the upper body. We do a lot of pulling movements, hangs, grip strength, just making sure that they're getting more muscle recruitment from muscles they're not using in soccer. And I think during that time too, the parent education is key because a lot of parents tend to freak out about gym training during the growth spurt. And I've had several girls come into me with knee pain, and parents are like, oh my gosh, is the gym going to make the knee pain worse? And I'm like, no, what makes the knee pain worse are movements that are putting more stress on the knee, which is all the running. They're doing at practices. So the strength piece is protective as long as we're controlled, selecting the right exercises. So there's a lot of parent education that has to go on
Well,
around that time.
I want to just ask you. I mean, this will give you a sense of the ideas also that we're dealing with in France, and this is like the FFF, the French National Federation. Most people that you talk to, coaches and parents and everybody else, if you say, "Oh, the kid, they need to strengthen, they need to strengthen," they all come back and they say, "Well, yeah, but if they strengthen, then that's going to affect their growth." And I think that's
Mhm.
like I have my own opinion on that, but
It
Yeah.
I'm
might be
just
the opposite. It might be the
Yeah.
opposite.
yeah. If you fail, well, like sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, look at gymnastics. Like in gymnastics, they strengthen, and look how short they are, and
Yeah.
that's kind of the logic. And I'm just curious what as like professionals who who've worked with this and worked with kids, what would you respond to that, and how early is
Yeah.
too early to to even start strength training and
Yeah. I think you can start as young as possible. I just had this conversation with another youth coach the other day, but ages 6 to 10, 11, just variety of movement. So jumping rope, climbing, tug of war, we do a lot with our young ones. Like it doesn't mean adding external load through the means of barbells. I
uh-huh.
think
Yeah.
that's where parents get really confused, and that's where they make those comments like, oh, strength training stunts growth because we're putting a 10-year-old under a barbell. Well, if you're with the right youth coach who understands long-term athletic development or has a background in PE, better yet, your kid's in the right hands. And as far as the growth argument, I always tell parents, again, the movements, a lot of the constant running and the same repetitive movements actually degrades the tissue more. And for the bones to grow and get stronger, they need variety of angles and tumbling movements, gymnastics like movements to really build. And then adding those light to moderate loads to provide even more of a stimulus to the bone is amazing. And Tony, I'm sure you can speak to this, but if you have a track athlete or a cross country athlete who's running in a straight line, it's really good to recommend to them, hey, maybe try a multi-directional sport as well, so you get that change of direction to build the bones, or consider resistance training a separate sport because you're using new muscle groups and working in different planes. So I think it really comes down to parent education. And I just don't think enough coaches are articulating these things well to parents because they either don't know long-term development or they're scared to tell the truth. I don't know what it
Well,
is, but
there's also an incentive issue, right? Like if you're a soccer coach, your incentive is just like a very short term, I want results right now. Don't care if they're overtrained, don't care if it's going to affect their long-term development. Like I'm this U11 coach and people are going to judge me on my results, so I want results here and now. And I think people just kind of throw out of the window things that are going to actually help improve the kid over the long term. I think there's an incentive issue.
Yeah. Oh, and I deal with those parents all the time, but I think my advice to coaches who work with youth is you just have to be honest with what development is. And, not everyone's going to listen to you. And I think I'm getting older in my career that I can't save everyone. I will always say my piece and explain the science behind growth and maturation and long-term athletic development and just what's going on with the causes of ACL injuries. And it's up to the parent if you want to take that and run with it or completely ignore me. I've stopped trying to save people, but I've found when you articulate it and speak from a place of care, parents usually tend to really buy in. So,
Tony, what do you think about about doing speed training over the growth cycle, going from pre-adolescent to in middle of puberty, then post-puberty? What should that look like, and how should it change according to where you're at in the developmental cycle? I'm curious to hear your ideas on that.
Well, I don't think I can articulate any better than Erica just did. I believe that kids need to be exposed to a variety of stimuli. And too often, the sport, if we only reverse engineer the sport, we develop unhealthy athletes who are fragile. And I think it's really important. Erica has used the thing about track and field where we are running as fast as we can in a straight line unless we're on the curve, and then we're slightly running on a curve. But I have found that my track and field only athletes are not as healthy as my multi-sport athletes. Why is that? They are getting exposed to a stimulus. For example, in basketball, you are stopping and starting, you are twisting. It is multiplanar, multi-directional. You are constantly moving. You're exposed to so many different movements playing the sport of basketball that basketball players become bulletproof in track and field. Whereas a track and field guy who's running in a straight line is not exposed to multi-direction, multiplanar. They're not twisting and all those things. And another thing they're not doing is that as they run through the finish line, they are decelerating very gently. Whereas if you are a soccer player or a basketball player or a football player, you have almost violent decelerations. And those violent decelerations will snap an ACL, especially in a girl. And that snapped ACL means that you go through 12 to 14 months of hell in rehab. You're not getting better. You are mentally and physically depressed. You are a young person that's living like a grandmother or a grandfather because you are on the shelf physically. And so I think that it's just so important to expose kids to things they are not exposed to in soccer. And then there's one other comment I wanted to make. I love Bill's or Lee's stuff. Lee, what was your term again? Cognitive recognition?
Cognitive load, I think you were saying.
Yeah.
Cognitive load. So we've already, I love that term. I love the fact that we've kind of established that we would rather have a fast soccer player than a slow one. Okay. We've kind of established that exposure to high speeds, the stimulus of high speeds, will make you healthier. We've kind of established through Lee's comments about cognitive load having a positive effect or speed having a positive effect on cognitive load. And then the fourth thing, and this goes to what you saw with Dan Ashman, that with the elimination of traditional conditioning, he is able to still put a soccer team on the field that appears to be extremely fit in late in the game. So
And that
late in
and
the,
that and that wins because of its fitness. It's not just he can do it. It's like he wins because of it. That's
for
the
sure. And we call that speed reserve. That if you can run, I hate to use miles per hour because I'm speaking to a bunch of Europeans as well, but if you can run 22 miles an hour as a male athlete, you are one of the fastest people on the field. If fatigue slows you down by 10%, you are still faster than people who run 20 miles an hour. And I think that's a really, really important idea is that is that maybe you are not as in shape as a well-conditioned athlete who has worked and worked and worked on endurance. But because you've improved on the critical qualities of speed and power, that you have just a higher reserve. And that as you diminish through fatigue, you are still relatively fast. I simply say that the fastest athletes at the end of the game, or the fastest athletes in the game, are also the fastest athletes at the end of the game, regardless of fatigue. So once again, in all four of those situations, whether we're talking just speed improves soccer, cognitive load, injury prevention, and now an alternative way to show fitness. A way to show fitness that does not detrain the qualities that win in soccer. So all those things fit together, and I'm like ready to, spike the football or drop the mic or whatever, because all those things are just so important. And when you look at the idea that it's only 20 minutes twice a week and you can do everything else as long as you don't burn the steak, it's a pretty good idea.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that is like going back to this to the multi-sport approach, that the science really backs that up. There was there's a paper published recently, and I think it was Science, like the one of the biggest flagship journals in all of science, showing that, and they looked at athletes, but also intellectuals, people who went on to become expert musicians or expert chess players, but then also like high level athletes, and they kind of trace back through their childhood where they were at different points. And it's actually like the most common story for elite athletes was that like when they were young, they didn't actually shine in the sport that they ultimately went on to specialize in. They tended to do multiple things. So like if you became a professional soccer player when they were young, a lot of times they would have a choice between like soccer, tennis, skiing. Like you take like Sinner, for example. Yannick Sinner, world's number two tennis player, up until the age of 13, he was doing soccer, he was doing skiing, and he was doing tennis. And at the age of 13, he specialized. And you see this, but you see a trade-off where you have to accept, if you want the long-term outcome that's going to the best or the optimal strategy in the long term, you have to accept when you're young, prior to specialization, not being the top one. Because what you see is that those kids that when they were like if you looked at them in their sport that they ultimately went on to specialize in when they were young, they were close to the top performers, but they were rarely like the top one when they were like 10. So there's a trade-off, and kind of a long-term trade-off that people have to make. And I think psychologically that can be difficult for parents and for kids to accept. Okay, like when you're 10, you're doing multiple things, you're doing strength training, and maybe you're not, the top one. But if you keep with it, 5 years later, it's going to pay off. You're going to have to believe in that and that story. But in any case, yeah, the science really backs that up.
Yeah.
And real
I
life
think
backs
that,
that up as well. Ryan
yeah.
Krauser, who gold medalist in the shot put, 3 consecutive Olympics, world record holder. His number one sport was basketball in high school. His number two sport was football, and his number three sport was track and field. But of course, he becomes the greatest in the history of the world in track and field. And I think the other thing that the multi-sport approach does is keeps kids fresh mentally. But we also know that soccer, especially in the United States now, is becoming a 12-month-a-year sport. Uh, Kids are specializing in soccer at the age of 7. So what do we do if they aren't playing other sports? They have to be exposed to other stimuli as they are training, whether it's speed, plyometrics, change of direction, excel and decel. They have to have great RSI, a great bounce. They have to do things like throwing things, even though it's not a part of the actual sport that they have dedicated their lives to. And I think that this multi faceted approach keeps kids healthier mentally and physically.
But I think there's a risk with the multifaceted approach, which is that, you could like imagine you have a really committed 9-year-old or 10-year-old soccer player, and they want to do the full year-round thing. But then they also hear this podcast or hear this webinar, and they're like, oh, I should be doing multiple things. So they could just throw on more. So they could do all the soccer, but then it's like, oh, I should be playing tennis too, and I should be doing strength training too, and I should be doing. So they just put on more and more volume. And
Yeah.
that can't be good for their
No,
long-term
that's not
development, right? So that's the that
right.
think
This
that's
is
the
where soccer clubs, certainly professional soccer clubs, have got to do better. This is where instead of just doing soccer all year round, which is all year round pretty much here in the UK now as well, is within certain periods of the year, they've got to be doing other types of sports that they can sort of generally link. Whether the science says that it's transferable or not, there's a lot of science that says if you do basketball because of explosive jumping power, it still doesn't really relate or transfer over to soccer. Forget that for a second, the science, which I know obviously the scientists here, but I think to get what Erica was saying about, different types of movement, getting more different spectral movements, clubs have got to do better and across the week include different types of sports. Going back to the 70s, I actually used to do judo, jiu-jitsu, gymnastics. So this is nothing new. This has been around for 50 odd years. It's just that in the main, we're so obsessed with it's just got to be soccer all year round and nothing else if you want to make it in the game.
totally. But I
Yeah,
think,
and
but this, but
there are actually European clubs, some of them doing a great job with their youth academies. Dr. Sean Cumming, I think he's still at University of Bath in Scotland. I forget, but
in England, yeah, in England,
yeah,
yeah.
he's implemented a lot of programs within their academies where, yes, these kids are playing soccer year round, but they look at load, but they also have gymnastics gyms and jungle gyms where they get a second sport essentially where they're climbing on monkey bars, they're rolling on mats, they're bouncing on trampolines. So I think if clubs can develop that model instead of doing extra conditioning that's like overusing the same muscles and burning these kids out. I mean, some of these play games and gymnastics drills are conditioning in themselves, but they're working different muscle groups. So that's more bang for buck for me. And there are some clubs in Europe doing a good job with it. The US is way behind in the physical development sense of the younger kids. But I think with like performance coaches,
It's not behind France. I don't think it can be worse than
yeah.
here.
I think everyone thinks theirs is the worst, but um, I think us like speed performance coaches and practitioners really take for granted what we got in our childhood, and we all sound like a bunch of bitter old people. Oh, well, back in the day, we played on the playground,
You
but
don't
I
remember
think
the
it,
old days. You're way
yeah,
too young
right,
to remember. Back in my
yeah, and
day,
we take that for
I never saw a coach till I was 14 years of age.
exactly, but now it's hard because times have changed, but I think coaches again have this opportunity to implement these play type movements in their club, in their gym. We do it with all ages. I do it with my 11-year-olds and my 18-year-olds. We get that variety. We'll always do a fun game that works on a different athletic quality before we start speed and strength, like more of the formal stuff. We'll
Mm-hmm.
do eye tracking games where they're reacting and catching a tennis ball, or they're playing wall ball or four square. We're doing tug of war for strength, or we're walking on rope barefoot to work on balance and really build the feet. I mean, we do all that. We spend 10 minutes doing that instead of doing a traditional warm up. So, like, I see that as more bang for buck because they're not getting it at all. And we can say, oh, well, parents just need to get their kids outside. They're just not doing it.
Yeah.
So, I think the rest of us just have to find ways to incorporate this stuff in,
What?
and
Yeah.
especially the cognitive work. I'm a huge fan of working on eye tracking and scanning and reacting. And I think if we can blend that with the Feed the Cats program, I mean, you have a perfect storm.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Brent, sorry, I've just realised the time. I've so much enjoyed listening to Tony and Erica today. The time's escaped me. I've got a hard stop. So, an absolute pleasure listening to you two guys. It was very, very interesting. So, and it was great. It was great to meet you. So, hopefully, we can talk in the future as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Lee.
Thank you.
Thanks for participating.
Yeah,
So
no, thank you for having me.
let's maybe keep going for another 5, 10 minutes, Erica and Tony, if you guys can. So I wanted to walk through as well so just going back to the strength training. So if I'm thinking about, so you have like, let's say 8 to 10, Erica, based on what you were saying, you're looking at mostly body weight. Then you get to the kind of pre-adolescent phase. You're out of childhood and you're in the pre-adolescent phase, so maybe 11 up to about 13, where they're about to hit puberty, but haven't really started the big growth spurt yet, but they're growing at a faster rate. At that moment, what do you think is kind of optimal in terms of strength training? Because like at that there you're starting to teach some of the weightlifting, and maybe you're adding on some weight, not just using body weight. Is that correct? And then how do you couple that with the speed training, and how do you make it so that the strength training is contributing towards like speed and overall athleticism?
It's going to be very individual because a 12-year-old might be different than another 12-year-old teammate of theirs.
Yeah.
So one of them might be further along in the maturation process, or one of them might just be really coordinated and can move well and start to do loaded squats or learn how to hip hinge and deadlift. So it's really individual. I have a lot of parents ask, well, what age do you start adding weight? And I'm like, I can't give you like a straight answer here. I think it really depends on the maturation status and
Sure.
then their
Yeah.
training age, meaning, how developed are they with years of movement skills under their belt?
Hmm.
Were they getting outside a lot in childhood or doing the right gymnastics type movements, or have they done none of that at all and they've only touched a soccer ball? So that's a very low training age athlete who might not be able to progress as fast. So it's really going to depend, but with athletes who can move well, I found sometimes adding an external weight like gets their technique cleaned up. So maybe instead of doing a body weight squat, I'll add a light dumbbell and they do a goblet squat, and it actually looks better than the body weight. So it's really nuanced, and I think it comes down to the coach's eye too in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, fair enough. So you'd want the form to be there, basically. You want them to have a really good
Oh yeah,
ability to move properly and to execute the form before you add any
technique
sort of weight.
first.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because strength training makes things more permanent. So if we're doing the movement patterns with poor technique and then we add load on top of that poor technique, then it's going to continue to get worse. So I'm in no rush with a lot of these kids. Some of my girls start lifting more heavy around age 13 or 14 when they're past that growth spurt.
Uh-huh.
And they've really proven that they have these movement patterns nailed down.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then, like, if you think about like past the growth spurt, like Tony, I know that you're a big advocate of like French contrast method. When would you start doing that? Like, what is the French contrast method? People who aren't familiar with it, and why is that useful for building speed and athleticism in particular? And once you hit adolescence and you're kind of past the growth spurt.
I think it goes right back to exposures to stimuli. For example, as much as I talk good about the weight room, if you are weight room only, I think you're just as guilty as soccer only. In other words, if you're weight room only, you might become less mobile, less fast, less agile, but yet, so you have to expose those athletes in the weight room to a secondary stimulus. And so if you could imagine pairing something like a squat, you put some weight on the bar, or you get in a squat machine or whatever, and you do 8 good squats with perfect mechanics, perfect form. Then you would go over and do maybe 5 hurdle hops or 5 pogo jumps. So you go from a slower, stronger contraction and recruitment of muscle fibers to a more elastic, faster recruitment. And so by pairing those two things, it's contrasting things, but yet they're kind of related. And once again, we just keep exposing kids to things they are not exposed to in the sport itself. As you know, Brent, several soccer, and also Erica, I think we've had this discussion as well. Many soccer coaches say, yes, we do speed training, but it's always with a ball. Well, that's going to be half speed. because the ball slows you down. And you say, well, they always have a ball in soccer. Well, you know what? We don't care because we need to expose them to velocities they've never been exposed to. And I was just thinking, one of the things that we do in track and field, which might blow people's minds, is we sprint backwards. We sprint backwards. Where is that in track and field? Is there a backwards race? Is there any field event that requires you to take your body and run fast backwards? Absolutely not. So why do we do that? We do that because we have learned that people who are exposed to things like that are healthier. They have healthier hamstrings. I really believe that retro sprinting is one of the very best things you can do for your hamstrings.
Hmm.
And so, wow, I wonder why people who only run north have hamstring problems. Well, maybe they need to run south some as well. So those exposures are really important. And once again, it does not have to be 2 hours of exposure. It might be 15 seconds a week, but that exposure is really important.
Hmm. But I was just wondering, like I'm just thinking back to some of the interactions and conversations we've had with specific, soccer clubs who are interested in this, and they're going to have. I'm thinking about the older age groups now, under 14 all the way through under 18, maybe even into the adults. If you wanted to, group in, so you have the preseason. How would you break it up? So you have the preseason, and then you have during the season where they might have 4 trainings a week, 5 trainings a week, plus a match. And it's always very high. The coaches love intensity. If you could modify something, so you have so we talked about this idea of having, warm-ups where you maybe have 2 warm-ups a week where it's more sprint oriented. But you say you also wanted to do strength training and you wanted to do French contrast training. How would you weave that into a weekly schedule? And then, how would that break down preseason versus end season?
Well, I
And
think, first of all, really small doses. Like I'm a small dose guy, minimum effective dose. Some people have argued, no, it needs to be minimum optimal dose, but we don't know what optimal is from kid to kid. We are just guessing. We can't plug a kid into a machine and say, okay, his optimal dose a day is 8 sprints, but this kid should only do 3. So we always want to err on this side of undercooking our steak. We don't want to overcook the steak. So I think in the off season we can first of all resist the urge to do almost entirely endurance training. Just forget about that. Instead, exposure to multiple things that involve speed, strength, jumping, bouncing, and throwing. I think we can do more of that in the off season. Should we still do soccer related activities? Absolutely, but I think we can do more of the other. Now, in the actual sport of soccer, the first thing we need to do is try the best we can to reduce the load of practice and games. That we need to stay as fresh as possible during the week. Now, then we can add a
So
couple.
would you throw out for example, say you had a team that was training 5 times a week, hour-and-a-half sessions, high intensity every session. Would you just be like, if you could organize that team schedule plus a match, so 6 days basically. If you could organize that team schedule, would you just throw out one of the sessions and replace it with the strength and speed session?
I would want to do that with all of my heart and soul. I would want to give Wednesdays off. What we have found is when we take a day off, our kids have almost see better improvements than a day on. So I love a 4-day work week. I love 3 days being totally off. Now, in a situation where the tradition is 6 days a week, that may be impossible. But if I couldn't take one day off of those 6 days, I would at least try to have an undulating, that word was used by Erica earlier, a high-low system where maybe you have a high day on Monday, but then it's a more relaxed, no sweat, fundamental day the next day. And you mentioned weightlifting as well, and I think weightlifting in season should be something like the sprint training, where we are not going in for a 75-minute
Yeah.
workout
Low dose.
after a 2-hour practice. No, we're going to go in and we're going to give kids 3 lifts, maybe a push, a pull, and a hinge. That's it. a push, a pull, and a hinge. Let's do 3 sets of 5 with each. Kids will be like, hey, we can get done with that in 15, 20 minutes. And they will actually approach it with more intent, I believe, when you reduce the time. Anybody that has not read the book Essentialism or the book by Greg McKeown that I'm reading now, I'm trying to think, I just lost track. I believe it's basically making it look easy, but that's not the title of it. So it's Greg McKeown, McKeown. But essentialism is kind of the feed the cat's Bible, where anytime we can reduce the quantity, we improve the quality. And the fresher mentally and physically we are, the better we are at performing all things. So I think that there's a way to microdose speed and strength and those other stimuli in season. I call that those other stimuli X factor work, and not take away anything from the training itself. But we should always look to compact our work.
So Erica, yeah, I'm curious also to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if there's, I mean, I hope there's not coaches doing 5 high intensity days in a row.
I mean, I might be exaggerating. Maybe
I would
it's
hope that's
yeah.
not going on, but
I think there is a tradition where they have the day before a match, they'll lighten off the load.
okay,
I think there's
thank
that,
goodness.
and I might be wrong about the number of days. Like maybe it's 4 days instead of 5 days, but it just seems like a lot to me in terms of the load.
Yeah. Yeah. So here in Florida, our best travel soccer teams practice 4 days a week. So I'm against it when those 4 days are high intensity days in a row. We have an amazing French coach actually at one of the U14 teams, and he does such a good job periodizing those days. He'll do a low day, day after the game, or give them fully off, and they just do 3 days a week. And then middle of the week is their highest day, highest intensity, and they taper off on Thursday, a few days before the games. And the girls come in with me on practice days because I want the high days to be high. And then when low days are low and they're off, I don't want them training with me. So if Friday or Sunday are their 2 days off a week, do not come see me because, like Tony said, you have to have that recovery. Otherwise, you're not getting the most out of the speed and the strength training, and we're not going to get an adaptation. So I think if coaches can periodize well and work with the speed and performance coach on what days are going to be high, then all is good. And then we're getting those 2 full off days a week. Ideally, that's what I would want to see with
Yeah,
youth
that's interesting.
athletes,
Yeah,
because professional athletes get that, right?
I think
They
as
get
I
two
think as
off
the
days a
levels
week, they get an
yeah.
off season.
Yeah, I think
So
as the levels go up, they tend to get they tend to be better in the
they get
periodization.
more recovery, which is kind of interesting because growing kids need more recovery and load management because of all the growth spurt injuries. And yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Dan, who I guess is who keeps coming back into the conversation, who's maybe here with us spiritually, even if not. But he has this whole thing about low intensity training, which I really think is interesting, where he thinks that like there's like too much, and this is more from Bolivia than it is in France. So I do think in France they do tend to taper it maybe a little bit better. But I think what he's seen in Bolivia is that like it's just like very like high intensity, high intensity, high intensity. And he has this idea, well, there should be some days where you're actually training skills at a lower intensity, almost like a tennis lesson, where you can be working on the fundamentals of, how you're shooting, your passing, your first touch, and
Like
that
a
you could
walkthrough.
almost like a walkthrough where you're
Yeah.
I play tennis, for example. Like when I play tennis, sometimes I intentionally play at a slower speed just so I can concentrate on the quality of each gesture and my footwork and everything else. And you could imagine technical sessions. So instead of having 4 high intensity sessions, you maybe have one, which is like a technical session where you have like you're just a skills coach who's there looking at the work or whatever. And then that creates the window for you to put in maybe strength work or maybe speed work, whatever, without introducing too much volume.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm going to have to leave
Yeah,
because
likewise.
Yeah, I gotta run too.
but I
Okay.
want to add one word that I don't know was mentioned here, and I think that it's just as important as everything we've talked about, and that's joyful. That with I was going to say especially with kids, but damn it, I really think it's with professionals as well. That the more joyful we can make training, the longer the athlete will stay in the game, the healthier that athlete will be. And I just think it's a better way to live. And I think that too often practice was intentionally miserable because somehow that's how soldiers did it in war or something. And I think that joyful training is a real key to everything we're talking about here. And I think you can do that when you are trying not to burn the stake, keep kids healthy mentally and physically, and to reduce loads.
Okay. Well, Erica, Tony, thanks so much for your time. This was really, really fascinating. I really, really enjoyed the discussion. And I'll hopefully see you both soon.
Yeah. Thank you, Brent. This was awesome.
That
Thanks,
really was.
everyone.
Thank you. See you, Erica.
All
Bye
right.
bye.
Bye, Tony.